everyone's okay with that, I will continue. Before I begin this webinar on Minnesota's journey with wild rice, I'd like to recognize that here in Minnesota, we're on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary territory of Dakota and Anishinaabe, and to acknowledge them as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. And if any of you are joining us from afar, I invite you to share a land acknowledgement as well if you would like. I guess we don't have the chat really, it's more of a Q&A, but I guess you can put it in there too. My name is Megan Mitchell, and I'm here today on behalf of the Finland Wild Rice Project. The Wild Rice Project is part of the Finland food chain, which was founded in 2018 to support the development of a comprehensive local food system for the Finland area and also the greater Arrowhead region of Minnesota. And the Wild Rice Project aims to provide educational training like this, mentorship, and a sense of responsibility to protect the rights of Menomin, Pasine, wild rice, and also give opportunities for processing of other small grains in the region. Here with me today is Dan Cahill-Matthews, also from the Finland food chain. He's here as co-host and will be helping me with the technical side of things. And of course, our presenter is Annette Drewes. She's here to share with us this very interesting history. Thank you so much, Annette, for joining us. I will let her introduce herself in a moment. A few logistical things. As I said, we'll be recording. You should all see a Q&A button at the bottom. Feel free to put your questions in there as we go, but we're going to get to answering them at the end after Annette's presentation. And I guess without further ado, we will go ahead and let Annette start.
Great, thanks for having me on. I am going to share my screen as we get moving here, and can everyone see that?
Yep.
Okay. It's a little bit different for me doing it this way. As Megan said, my name's Annette Drewes. I've been really interested in wild rice for many years. I'll give you some background on that in just a moment. But what I wanted to focus on when Megan and I were talking about what kind of topics could I bring or new information might I bring to wild rice, something I've been doing a little bit of research on after my own research is really how did some of these regulations come to be with wild rice? What's some of the backstory that we really don't know today that occurred, mostly in the 1900s. So today's presentation is the Minnesota's journey with wild rice. I'm really appreciative of the Finland Food Co-op for hosting this webinar. I live in northern Minnesota, although I'm coming to you today from upstate New York, where I'm awaiting the birth and arrival of a granddaughter. I have harvested wild rice for only a short time, relatively 14 years, but I'm passionate about bringing information and recognition of wild rice forward to those who are unfamiliar with it. So where did my wild rice journey begin? My story with wild rice began around the turn of the 21st century. My husband and I had returned to northern Minnesota, Bemidji specifically. White Earth Nation was in the news. They were raising red flags about the research taking place at the University of Minnesota, which was focused on mapping the genome of wild rice, or Menomin, as the plant is known in Ojibwe. And I also began canoeing the Turtle River, near Bemidji, Minnesota. It does lead into the Mississippi River. Here on the river is where I first encountered wild rice, the plant. And I say that because I knew nothing about the plant, what it looked like, how wild rice grew, anything. But I'd been eating wild rice most of my life because I grew up in Minnesota. And of course, it's our state grain. So in 2003, I returned to school at the University of Wisconsin-Madison to answer one question: who is watching out for wild rice? And when I say who, I had worked for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources for several years. There's fisheries division, there's waters division, there's all these divisions, people dealing with deer hunting. I never ran across anyone dealing with wild rice. And then I found it was very, very small group. And yeah, so that was my question. Who is managing or watching out for wild rice? And knowing full well about the tribes and their relationship with wild rice, I looked at both tribal areas, treaty ceded areas, and state wild rice lakes. So today I'm not going to spend much time at all about the plant. I assume most people know much or quite a bit about it. It's an aquatic plant. It grows annually from seed every year, typically growing in depths of water up to 3 feet. There is wide variation in growing patterns across northern Minnesota and Wisconsin. If you've seen the plant growing in late May or early June, you've probably seen it in the floating leaf stage shown here in the bottom left. Once it begins to rise from the water, female flowers emerge first. And I'd be interested to know if anyone's seen those before on the plant. When it's very short is when you're going to find them. They're very small, tiny tufts at the base of each hull that needs to be pollinated for a seed to form. Once this moves up, the male flowers come out in late July. They're very showy, lots of color to them, and they hang out in branching arms, dripping pollen. Finally, late in August, around Labor Day, a solid field of wild rice will resemble a wheat field with nodding heads of full seeds showing dark against a blue sky. So today I'm taking you on a journey that began in 1858 when Minnesota became a state. There are really 3 stories that intertwine here, and I'm just going to have enough time to kind of touch the top of them so that you can begin to ask your own questions, and I'll be providing some resources if you want to go find more information. But one is a story of taking and damages, a story that still continues today about the land and water wild rice grows on. The second is a story of propagation and claiming, advancing the use of wild rice for economic gain. And the third story is really one of regulation through legislation. All of these stories continue today, and in the time we have, hopefully I'll be able to answer some questions, but also just kind of get you more interested as I was when I started looking at some of these questions even after my research had finished. So Minneapolis and St. Paul, as you are aware of if you live in Minnesota, thrive because of the Mississippi River. In the late 1800s, moving lumber and grain on the river often proved challenging, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers actually commissioned some studies to look at holding back some waters for those times when flow on the Mississippi River was low and being able to increase water levels. They came up with the idea of, okay, they did a study. So they didn't just come up with the idea, but did a study to look at where could they create reservoirs on the Mississippi River. And they selected Leech Lake, Winnibigoshish, and Pokegama lakes and this was in the years of 1880 is when it began, going up through the late 1880s. Although building these dams did not go very smoothly, realized that at this time several Ojibwe villages, which were within these treaty ceded areas, and some of them were actually on reservation lands, those Ojibwe villages would have to be moved, and the because they would be drowned out by the expanding water. And the US government had to come to some sort of offer for the tribes in losing their homelands and losing a lot of the wild rice. There's a report or a article, Dams and Damages by Jane Lamb Carroll, that was done in the book, or it's not a book, it was an article, Minnesota History, in spring 1990. She worked for the Corps and was studying wild rice and looking at what happened with this. This one event, putting in dams on the Mississippi River and the tributaries, ran across generations. If you work with some of the Ojibwe tribes, any of the Ojibwe tribes, really, you will see this is near and dear to their hearts. Obviously, this is not history. This is something that actually wasn't settled until 1985, 100 years later, settling for compensation for lands that were lost during this time. You can also see they were, the amount of money that was first offered to them was abysmal in all sense. And there were people in Minnesota, legislators and stuff, trying to help the tribes get more money. They ran through 4 or 5 commissions before, and lots of legal action before seeing this happen or seeing any settlement to this. Dams are still impacting wild rice, and if you're familiar with how wild rice grows, wild rice water level can drown out wild rice very easily. And of course, some of the original wild rice beds on Winnibigoshish have been drowned out due to the higher water levels. Pokegama has a wild rice bed there now. It just moved and adjusted where a lot of wild rice used to be. This is a more up-to-date picture of the Leech Lake Reservation here in pink, and part of the White Earth Reservation to the left side of the picture. And what I wanted to show is you can see the 3 dams with the red X's. Leech Lake, I don't know if you can see my pointer, Winnibigoshish, and this purple ribbon is the Mississippi River here. But those pink those pink triangles are a current inventory of dams. We have a lot of dams. They're not all big like the ones that holding back the reservoirs. Many of these are very small dams. The second thing to look at on this map are wild rice lakes, and those are the lakes that show up in green. This area of northern Minnesota, specifically in the Mississippi Headwaters watershed and the Leech Lake River watershed, water levels play a real important role as to whether or not wild rice can even grow. They really impact the growth of wild rice. So there are a lot of regulations I'm not going to cover, but whether it's county land use or road building that are put in sometimes at the detriment of wild rice if that information is not known by road builders. It can all impact wild rice when we start talking about changing water levels on the landscape. Here in this area of Minnesota, this north central, is where wild rice is most abundant in the entire state. So I'm going to shift from the land and water, which has been impacted, of course, for decades, to the interest of European settlers on wild rice itself. One of the first things Euro settlers recognized about wild rice was its attraction to waterfowl. Prior to the 1900s, sportsmen's groups, especially out east, were buying wild rice from people in Minnesota and planting it in ponds and wetlands to attract ducks and geese for hunting. Many of these plantings failed in part because people buying the wild rice didn't know much about the seed, and some of them were receiving parched wild rice, basically wild rice ready to eat, which is no longer a viable seed. So agriculturalists with the with the USDA Bureau of Plant Industry at the time did some research. And basically, part of this research came about because the seed had been extensively marketed, but was typically not germinating. And so they wanted to understand that better. There was also this belief or this attraction that, wild rice grows nowhere else in the world as much as it does here in the Midwest around the Great Lakes. And this could really be a North American product that we can propagate and be commercial hub for wild rice. And I find it interesting, right above the ducks there, you'll see the desirability of propagating a plant which will make the otherwise wastewater areas of the upper Mississippi Valley yield a valuable and highly esteemed cereal. So there was the thought that many of these areas, if they weren't producing something, could in fact maybe produce wild rice. And at the same time, in 1903, 1902, wild rice had already made its debut at the nation's capital, being served at the White House as a side dish, or we would say hot dish here in Minnesota. I'm sure they say casserole out in the East Coast. So I wanted to share this piece of information as I go through the rest of today's presentation. I found this to be an invaluable resource that I stumbled upon actually after my research, because I had questions primarily about who set the harvesting hours that are in existence today from 9 to 3. And I could never get an answer from the DNR or anyone else. We knew who set them, the DNR set them, obviously, or the legislature, but why they were set that way. And that really led to most of this other research. But this particular piece, the wild rice mystique, resource management and American Indians' rights as a problem of law and culture, was written in 1984. And most of the references I provide in the following slides will come from this. And one of the interesting statements on here, Minnesota has played a significant role in the history of wild rice in the 20th century through legislation, regulation, and research. These activities have led to the piecemeal development of a de facto policy on wild rice management. And it's really interesting because you do have to understand, how did the pieces that are in place now come to be there before we can move ahead with any changes that we might see. So two trends began in the 1900s. Wild rice had made its way all the way to the White House. So definitely harvesting and selling of natural wild rice was going on to outside markets outside of Minnesota and Wisconsin. And there was an interest in being able to farm or cultivate wild rice for commercial sale. Because as you know, natural wild rice has a pattern of boom or bust at times, and you couldn't always be depended on were the words being used. In 1931, because at this point in time, think about the era that we were in, we're at the end of the Great Depression, or the beginning of the Great Depression. Money was short, cash was short, so people found that there was a market for wild rice, and there was no regulation, so anybody could go out and harvest wild rice in any way that they saw or deemed fit. And what did occur on several small lakes, especially close to the cities, where Euro settlers saw Native Americans harvesting wild rice and thought, why are they going out multiple days? We can do this much more efficiently, and created some machines that would just literally go into a field, cut off the rice heads, and that way they would gather it all. Of course, there was a great uproar about this because it's an annual plant, and cutting off the heads, the seeds were not all ripe, and it took all of the seeds rather than depositing some for next year's crop. As demand continued to grow in the 1940s, and actually before the 1940s, there came a Ojibwe chief, Chief Madison, in 1939. So these original laws were put on in 1931. There wasn't a whole lot of enforcement behind those. And there was also growing demand. And Chief Madison and others who were harvesting natural wild rice became concerned. He went to Representative Joseph Preferl, who was actually a newly elected state representative, and asked him if he was interested in helping to preserve one of the important factors for the life of the Indian. And the problem, as he presented it, was non-Indians were coming onto the reservations. They were going to these big wild rice beds, harvesting rice with machinery, capturing all the seed, and they were devastating the rice crop. So between the two of them, they put together information and crafted the statute that became Statute 8410 with the supervision of harvest. Now I'm presenting this as a snapshot because there's so much underneath this. Chief Madison was able to help craft this, but at the same time, legislators were recognizing that, you know, if the tribal members don't have access to wild rice, this is something that can sustain them through the winter. They're in danger of being added to some of these relief roles in the counties that they're burdened with through from the Great Depression, from people not having access to food and not having access to jobs. And so the state recognized it. There was also some committee meetings going on, and there was the tribes were actually meeting as well. The state met with them and wanted to say, hey, what about us supervising the management of wild rice? Interestingly enough, the tribes didn't agree to supervision. They wanted the state to provide protection. However, there was another federal thing going on at this time, which was the Indian Reorganization Act. And with that, that gave the state some ability to step into a position where they began supervising the harvest of wild rice in 1939. Interestingly enough, one of the only supporters of this legislation, well, there were multiple supporters that wanted to protect, but to put some of the restrictions of harvest, most of the non-Indians did not support that. But researchers from the University of Minnesota actually supported and stood behind the tribes on this one, saying that the Indian means of harvesting wild rice was really the way to continue having a good rice harvest. So some of the specifics in the 1939 statutes are still there today. Some of them have been modified slightly. Indians were granted exclusive rights on Indian land. So within the reservation borders, and many people ask about that, only tribal members can harvest, and the tribes have the ability to determine who can or cannot harvest within reservation borders. The measurements for boats, of course, it's non-motorized, licenses, and harvest hours are all under this statute, which has changed very little other than some licenses and hours. It was just in 2017, however, that state licenses were no longer required for tribal harvesters. And that was one of the complaints about the state taking over supervision was, of course, they were going to charge the Indians a license to harvest their own wild rice. So we moved through the 1930s and 40s. Wild rice is gaining some protection. Mechanical means of harvesting wild rice are off the table. However, the process of parching and drying and preparing the rice to be sold is not regulated. Whoops, we're getting an echo there. Okay. Dan, were there questions? Sorry, I haven't paused on that.
Nope, I think we're still looking good.
Okay. So in the 1950s and 60s, mostly non-Indian businessmen started looking at how can we parch and take some of this processing of wild rice that is very labor intensive and mechanicalize it. And so these were being adopted and used in the processing of wild rice. The demand for wild rice then was increasing. So mechanized means, some of those were being shared with the tribes, some were not. 1950s, many of those were sometimes being utilized by the bigger buyers of wild rice in order to both parch it, process it, and package it for distribution. So we start seeing in the 50s and 60s a lot more interest in wild rice and a lot more demand for the crop. Prices during this time increased from a pound to $4 to $5 a pound. And you can compare that to 70 years later. Basically, prices today are about $10 to $12 a pound for natural hand harvested wild rice. There were a couple of things that happened during this time. This is a graph on the right of licensed sales, and I just want you to look at 1958 on the left-hand side. It's about 1968. 1968 is the highest peak of harvester licensed sales by the state of Minnesota, and they reached over 16,000 licenses sold at that time. Licenses were only $3 at that point, but that's the peak of license sales since licenses began to be required for harvesting wild rice back in 1939. Because of this growing interest and growing just a lot of people out in the rice beds, I remember talking to one of the rice harvesters that I interviewed for my research, and 300 boats. If you know where Big Rice Lake is north of Virginia, Minnesota, imagine 300 boats out on that lake harvesting wild rice. So there was a lot of pressure on wild rice, in part because of that pressure. That is why we have the harvesting hours we have today from 9 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon. Those were set in 1959, and it was due to the pressure of wild rice. This was actually one of the questions I had when I started doing some of this research, because all I ever heard was, well, it's to protect the ducks. And maybe it was to protect the ducks from all the harvesters in the rice, but it was really to keep people from harvesting much longer and keep them on a short time in the rice beds. At the same time, in the 1959 through early 60s, interest in wild rice cultivation was began a little bit before that as well, I'm sure. And I just want to go on. So I want to move into cultivation a little bit, although I'm not going to cover a lot of it. The biggest issue about creating cultivated wild rice was shattering. Wild rice likes to leave the seed head as soon as it ripens. It becomes less attached and will drop off. And one plant could drop off ripe seeds for over a week's time. So finding plants that held on to their seed was one of the big challenges for those farmers who wanted to actually grow wild rice in some flooded fields. Beginning in 1959, the University of Minnesota collected their first seed plants. So it was they weren't crossbreeding at this point. They were going out to natural wild rice fields and finding non-shattering seeds. They found the first ones near Waskish, Minnesota, and it was actually in a farmer's field who had planted wild rice to try to grow it on some flooded lands. His name was Algot Johnson. Also at this time, as you might remember, this commercial interest and interest by scientists and researchers led to legislators starting in 1969 providing funds of $75,000 a year given to the University of Minnesota specifically for paddy rice research. And so the paddy rice research was funded through state legislation, went to the University of Minnesota, and was an annual funding source for the university. Even up to 1973, the amount was bumped up to $105,000 per year, and it continued quite a while up into the almost, went kind of back and forth. But this is where a lot of the funding came for the University of Minnesota to do their research. As wild rice was being developed as a cultivated crop and the seed was being developed for the state of Minnesota, legislation went in to make it the state grain of Minnesota, and that was passed in 1977. I couldn't really find any information on who introduced that. For several years, we've had a legislator, Rad Skoy, who was a commercial wild rice farmer, and so oftentimes the Commercial Rice Farmers Association became big supporters of the state trying to not subsidize, but to support research. I did want to highlight this book if you're interested to more understand where cultivation and development of the commercial wild rice came from. Saga of the Grain by Irwin Olke, who was one of the premier researchers at the U of M, recently published this book as well. So as cultivation of wild rice grew and wild rice became something more on the market due to it being farmed, conflicts between harvesters of natural lake wild rice and farmers began to grow. Farmers were labeling and selling their wild rice at prices that undercut hand harvested. And there was no way to tell from the packaging really why the prices were different. There were no labeling laws at that time. Some retailers even put pictures of Indians harvesting wild rice from canoes on their commercially grown wild rice. So this dispute and conflict led to the labeling laws in Minnesota. Minnesota is the only state with the labeling laws, and they're only effective in Minnesota. So it wasn't, it was facing, the labeling law was facing a lot of non-support in the legislature because they were arguing technically it's the same plant, it's not genetically different, it's the same plant, we shouldn't have to label it. So to address that, Ronald Libertus, who was the director of wild rice under the DNR at that time, actually came into the Senate chambers, cooked up cultivated wild rice alongside natural hand harvested wild rice, and had everybody sample that. That created a decisive vote that yes, these were two distinct, different entities, and now today still, if I won't go into the details because they get more confusing every year, but any wild rice that is cultivated or farmed has to have the label cultivated or farmed, or if it's mechanically harvested, which is a lot of the lake rice in Canada. And there may be some questions for that. This last graphic, I'm just getting to the end here. If you have some questions, we'll be able to answer those. But of course, legislation also manages harvesters. And what is interesting and important to look at in this graph of license sales over time, it starts at 1958 here on the far left, going to 2018. And I can tell you, because I just looked at everything up through 2022, nothing goes over 2,000 licenses a year annually. And this is for a state license. This is not the non-resident license. But the license sales are reflected the history of cultivated with natural lake rice is reflected in these license sales. 1961, 1968, this is all pre-cultivated wild rice. And you can see 1980 was kind of the peak of the last time we had any number over 4,000 harvesters. It was 12,000 license sales sold in 1980. This is about the time cultivated wild rice began to show up on the market and was grown in Minnesota. Up until about 1985, some farmers then decided, hey, wild rice, we could probably grow it on the same paddies as white rice out in California and maybe have better weather for it. And they did that. And in 1988, California surpassed Minnesota in paddy production of wild rice. Since that time, that whole commercial great interest in harvesting wild rice and being able to sell it, of course, there did come into conflict. And I've talked to many tribal members, and especially those who have found the international market now because of web and being able to advertise online. Selling wild rice, if people know what they're getting, if they know they're getting natural hand harvested wild rice, they're much more willing to pay than for the cultivated wild rice. And I've had that experience internationally as well. What restricts most of the natural wild rice sales is harvest. There are fewer people harvesting wild rice, and you can see this in the graphic. Under 2,000 licenses a year, typically around 1,500. It was only in 2017 here that tribal members did not need to purchase a state license for off-reservation harvest. And many things have changed in regards to tribal treaty rights. I shouldn't say they've changed, but they no longer need to have those state licenses on treaty ceded lands and lakes. And so we are actually getting both the tribes and the state, well, I would say the tribes are trying to bring back harvesting because a lot of it, some of the younger generation has not been harvesting, and you'll see wild rice camps, as I know, Finland Food did a wild rice camp, and many of the tribes are starting those wild rice camps and have been doing them to bring more information back to their communities. And that's all I have. Does anyone have questions? I see Dan put one up about how long does it take to hand parch versus mechanically parch wild rice? Oh, never mind. Sydney put that up. So hand parching wild rice. I'm open to anyone typing it. So I have done both. One of the aspects of hand parching wild rice, parching it is pretty easy in the sense that you need a fire, you need a kettle, and you stir it. For me, it takes about an hour to parch a couple of ice cream buckets full. And the hardest, most difficult part is the threshing, is getting the hull off. And that requires a lot of expertise, a lot of experience with that. So it is very time consuming. If you have a mechanical processor, we take the majority of our rice to a processor. A mechanical processor thresher can get that hull off in minutes. So it's much, much quicker. Sherry, I see your question. Is there a breakdown of where most licenses are purchased? Are you meaning in Wisconsin versus Minnesota?
Hi, Annette. I mean, like in Minnesota is more what I'm thinking. Is it primarily in the Arrowhead region and northern Minnesota where people are purchasing licenses as opposed to farther south in the state?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I didn't put that in my slideshow. One of the things, and I'm going to stop share so I can be on screen there better. One of the things I found in my research, because that's what I asked people, where are you from? I used zip codes to see who was harvesting the wild rice across the state. And primarily, if you look at where wild rice occurs and where the licenses are sold, they pretty much reflect the rice area. So most are sold up in northern Minnesota, and I wouldn't even say the Arrowhead. North central Minnesota is one of the largest areas, and also people from the cities often have ties back to the cities or back to areas where they grew up harvesting wild rice, but they no longer live there. So it is a pretty good reflection. If you look at where licenses are bought, they're typically bought in the areas where wild rice grows.
Thank you. I have another question.
Sure.
Some years ago, I was getting some rice from a fellow up in Grand Rapids, and he was had been in the field for a long time, and he gave me a can of popped wild rice, like that had been commercially canned. And he talked about a period of time when they thought they were going to be able to commercialize that. Do you know anything about that?
Not that specific can, but I have a friend who has been doing research. Her grandfather was actually one of those first non-Indian mechanical processing guys that worked. He grew up on the Mille Lacs Reservation. He was not a Mille Lacs band member, and he took parchers, two different, in fact, she found one of his parchers up on Boys Fort and helped the mechanization of processing get going. She went up to Canada, and it really interesting. I can't remember the name, but the First Nations people up in this one area she went to visit harvest wild rice, sell it to this non-native, who then processes it, cooks it, and puts it in cans, and then sells it back to the tribes and sells it in the grocery stores. But it's fully cooked wild rice. And there is a brand in, I think it's a different brand in Minnesota that comes fully cooked in a can, not popped.
Yeah, and pop. This is the first time I'd ever heard of it, that it being popped and then canned.
Yeah, interesting, because popped is usually an oil, and so I think of it being more dry.
I still have the can. So
You haven't opened it yet.
No.
I'll have to have a taste test. So I see another question about processors, and yeah, Wisconsin people are coming over to Minnesota. Minnesota, our limiting factor is processors as well. People are aging out. A&B Processing in Cass Lake, Minnesota, on the Leech Lake Reservation is one of two manufacturing or mechanical processing plants. They are right next to each other. The other one is Grimes, and that's not tribally owned. It's owned by an individual who's a Leech Lake band member. And A&B was owned by two brothers who are in their 70s, 60s, and one of them passed away. He's the one that's remaining, is trying hard to find somebody to take it over. It's because, as Finland knows, it's a very seasonal activity. And several of the processors I know over on White Earth have passed away. Their family members are taking on some of the processing, but it is a problem everywhere. And Madison Trout Lake impacts. Cool. So yeah, Colleen, so I went to Trout Lake actually because my research was out of Madison. And one of the, if you haven't heard about the carp study, you can Google it. Clam Lake in Burnett County, Wisconsin, was one of my study lakes. It's the St. Croix Superior have tribal harvesting rights on that lake, but it's also open to non-native harvesters. It had tons of wild rice in 2005, 2006. You couldn't find a single stem of wild rice. Researchers got involved and started looking at carp populations. Carp had been in that lake for years. It's ringed with, the whole north part is ringed with cabins. However, there had been an exponential growth in the carp population. It had been a really good year for reproduction. And then they started looking at, could it be carp? because that is what most people in Minnesota say why we don't have any more wild rice in southern Minnesota, because we have carp that could eat it and uproot it. This is the definitive study. They actually put exclosures and enclosures, planting wild rice, keeping carp out, and the only place wild rice grew that year was where carp were kept out. And they collected carp, and carp's bellies were full of wild rice. So yes, carp will eat wild rice. Wild rice can coexist if the balance is there. So that's the only study I know of that happened. But it was like shocking and awesome at the same time to actually have that designated. Yeah, Wisconsin, I'm interested if Danbury is still north. There's a processor near Dan to Anna. Greg, question?
I think I pushed the button by accident. Sorry about that.
That's all right. I know several people when I spoke with harvesters in 2006 and 7 were, some were trying to get thinking about starting processing. I mean, it's definitely a need. The threshing part is really the hardest part. And there is a First Nations man up in just north of Rainy River who actually makes these small, they look like grills, right, with threshers in them. And Cliffwick, Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, has purchased quite a few of those. They're electric, you plug them in, they have a motor, and it threshes. You have to have a certain amount in there, of course, otherwise it can really beat the rice up. But they've been working pretty good. They're made basically for people that maybe have 30 to 100 pounds or less that they want to harvest. Lori, is there a difference with nutritional value with different areas or types of growing wild rice or hand harvesting versus mechanical harvesting? Nutritional value is pretty much, I haven't heard anything looking at nutritional value changes across locations. One of the studies that have been done is looking at if you harvest wild rice, and if you've been lucky enough to harvest Wisconsin and Minnesota, and you can only do that if you're a Wisconsinite, because Minnesotans cannot harvest in Wisconsin. They do not allow non-residents to harvest. Their amount of wild rice that they have in the state of Wisconsin is about a quarter of the amount of wild rice that grows in Minnesota. That is not my statistic. That comes from Peter David, who has researched wild rice for Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission for years and just recently retired. But there's a size difference. So Nett Lake rice is very large. Danbury, Wisconsin has very large rice on some of the lakes, and it's usually a lake that has the larger, thicker rice. So Nett Lake up in northern Minnesota. Where you find smaller rice is the river rice. It tends to ripen sooner and it tends to be smaller, mostly probably dependent just on nutrients in the sediments. As far as hand harvesting versus mechanical harvesting, no, not really. Interestingly enough, in Canada, so if you go into stores, you'll find Canadian wild rice. It'll say Canadian lake wild rice, and it will say mechanically harvested, because in Canada they have an abundance of shallow lakes. So you actually rent a lake, you seed it by airboat or plane, and that is your lake to harvest. Most are harvested by airboats. So they're mechanically harvested, not hand harvested. But it is lake rice. So, and then you can go to California, where you can go to the farmer's market and they're selling you wild rice and they will say it's natural wild rice. And it's not. It's all coming from cultivated wild rice, but they do not have labeling laws out there. They do not have the population, the indigenous people out there who have the relationship with Menomin. And so they haven't faced put in place any of the safeguards we have here.
Yeah, I'm just gonna jump in and say that on our website, finlandwildrice.com, we've got an archived webinar on the studies of nutritional values of wild rice, and related to oncology, conducted by Dr. Emily Onello of University of Minnesota Duluth. And that was facilitated by our previous wild rice project coordinator, Abby, who might even be here today. And then also, speaking of processors, we've got a processor in Finland, in case anyone didn't know that. So it's a community not-for-profit processor. So we prioritize locals and actually have pretty small minimums. If people want to just try out ricing, it's actually possible to bring your rice in there and do small amounts. So I just wanted to put that plug in there.
Gary and Judith, I see your notes about the guy in Canada. I will try to find that information. Again, I had shared it. Gliffwick might have it. 1854 Treaty Authority might have it. And so Gliffwick purchased them and was just giving them to tribal partners, Sherry. David, I'd love your question. Do you think not enough people are ricing? Yes, I think, and that's my opinion. One of the interesting stories I heard, so I met over 250 harvesters when I was doing my research, and I interviewed 50 in depth. Many of them, about a third of them, were tribal harvesters. One of the things I kept hearing over and over is that because of the relationship between humans and wild rice, in order for wild rice to continue to grow, there needed to be people to harvest it. And I just found this fascinating. And if you think about it, when you're harvesting wild rice, you're planting wild rice, right? Less than 50% of the wild rice actually falls into your canoe when you're harvesting. And so you are planting and harvesting at the same time. That's not my story to, I mean, I get that. For me, I really want more people ricing from the perspective, and most of the people I've introduced to ricing, nobody's in it for commercial gain. If you've done it, you know it's a lot of work. But people that do it then recognize what this plant is, understand how special it is, and are much more likely to protect it. And for me, it's about conservation and protection of the wild rice. And I think we need to have people who are engaged and understanding what this plant is in order to protect it for the future. And yes, we don't want 1968 levels.
Yeah, last question.
So yeah, there's a research posted. I do have some, I'm transitioning websites, but Wild Rice Voices. I have both a Facebook page and you can search my name and Wild Rice and you'll probably get the website as well. But Wild Rice Voices is the website. Cooking time, any recipe that calls for wild rice and says to cook it for 40 minutes, that's commercial rice. If you cook natural hand harvested rice for 40 minutes, you're going to have mush. So yeah, but some of the new cultivated rice, they are taking more of the bran off, that dark coat, which does reduce the cooking time. All right. And feel free to reach out to me. I had my email there and it'll show up in the webinar. It's just Annette.Drewes@gmail.com. But thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much for bringing us that great presentation. That was awesome. You can all find the recording of this on our website under the Learn tab, along with several other great webinars that we've done in the past that we've been able to host. Also on our website, you can find a link to another webinar that we have coming up in 2 weeks. It's also a Thursday at 5:30 on June 8th about wild rice and sulfide mining with Paula Maccabee from Water Legacy, which is really exciting. She's going to tell us about how sulfate levels affect wild rice and what causes them to rise, and how we can all make a difference for clean water through volunteer citizen science. And that will definitely apply to ricers who are already out there on the water. On our website, you can also join the mailing list. I'll put that in the chat real quick. Somewhere. There's that in the chat. And also on the website, there's contact forms to sign up as a ricing mentee or mentor. We're looking for both for the upcoming 2023 season, which will be August and September. To inquire about our community processor, you can contact me on there. Again, that website's finlandwildrice.com. You can also find us on Facebook or in person at the Finland Farmers Market. That's going to be every Thursday starting June 15th, I think. And I will frequently be found there with an info table at least, and maybe even a few demos through the summer and fall. Thank you so much, Annette, for joining us, and to all of you for coming despite the beautiful day outside. I know it's a busy time for everyone, and we really appreciate you taking the time. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thanks.